For generations, the most powerful king in the ancient world was treated by mainstream archaeology as a legend, a story, a religious narrative embellished by centuries of retelling until the historical man, if he ever existed at all, had been buried so completely beneath this mythology that no spade, no survey, no excavation had ever produced evidence substantial enough to satisfy the skeptics. Scholars who spent their careers digging through the soil of the ancient Near East said it plainly and publicly. There was no archaeological evidence for King Solomon, no palace, no temple, no administrative infrastructure, no trace of the vast wealth and political dominance that the biblical text describes in elaborate, specific detail. The silence of the ground, they argued, was its own kind of verdict. And then the ground stopped being silent. One discovery after another in sites scattered across the ancient territory of Solomon's kingdom began producing evidence so specific, so precisely dated, and so structurally consistent with the biblical account, that the archaeologists who made these finds have had to sit with conclusions that the previous generation of their colleagues had declared impossible. King Solomon was real. His kingdom was real. And what has been pulled from the soil of the southern Levant in the last 2 decades is rewriting the history of the ancient world in ways that nobody fully anticipated. The problem that made Solomon so contested in modern archaeology was not simply a lack of evidence. It was a specific and influential school of thought, sometimes called biblical minimalism, that dominated the field from the 1980s through the early 2000s, and argued systematically that the biblical narrative of a unified Israelite kingdom under David and Solomon was a much later literary invention, probably composed during the Babylonian period, centuries after the supposed events, with no basis in historical reality. The minimalists had genuine archaeological ammunition for their position. The 10th century BCE, the period when Solomon is supposed to have reigned in Jerusalem, had yielded very little in the way of monumental architecture or administrative complexity in excavations around Jerusalem itself. The city was small, the material culture was modest. There was no evidence of the kind of large-scale construction projects, the palace, the temple, the administrative buildings, the military installations that the biblical text attributes to Solomon in specific and granular detail. Israel Finkelstein of Tel Aviv University became the most prominent voice of this skeptical position, arguing that the archaeological record of 10th century Jerusalem was inconsistent with a powerful regional kingdom capable of the building projects and trade networks the Bible describes, and that the biblical narrative reflected the political ambitions and literary creativity of later Judahite scribes, rather than genuine historical memory of a Solomonic golden age. This was not a fringe position. It was the dominant view in a significant portion of academic biblical archaeology through the 1990s and into the 2000s, and it shaped how the period was taught, discussed, and written about across a generation of scholarship. And then Khirbet Qeiyafa appeared. In 2007 and 2008, a team led by Yosef Garfinkel of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem began excavating a site in the Elah Valley, the same valley where the biblical text places the confrontation between David and Goliath, approximately 30 kilometers southwest of Jerusalem. What they found was a fortified city unlike anything previously documented in the region from the 10th century BCE. A massive city wall, constructed from enormous stone blocks, fitted together with a precision and scale that required significant centralized organization and labor to produce. 2 city gates, a feature explicitly mentioned in the biblical text as characteristic of Israelite cities of the period. A planned urban layout with residential structures arranged in a consistent pattern along the interior of the city wall. And beneath the destruction layer that ended the city's occupation, a collection of artifacts that radiocarbon dating placed with extraordinary consistency in the late 11th to early 10th century BCE, precisely the period of David and Solomon in the biblical chronology. The radiocarbon dates from Khirbet Qeiyafa were not ambiguous. Multiple independent laboratories tested material from multiple contexts across the site and returned dates clustering tightly in the period from approximately 1020 to 980 BCE. This is not the kind of dating uncertainty that allows for reinterpretation or methodological challenge. It is the kind of precision that removes the chronological question from the debate entirely and forces the discussion to focus on what the site actually represents. And what Khirbet Qeiyafa represents, as Garfinkel's team argued in a series of publications that transformed the field's understanding of 10th century Judah, is a sophisticated, planned, fortified Judahite administrative center operating at exactly the time the biblical narrative places the establishment of the Davidic Solomonic kingdom. The site also produced something that had never before been found from this period in this region in any excavation. A pottery shard inscribed with ancient Proto-Canaanite or early Hebrew text, the Qeiyafa Ostracon, containing what appears to be a written administrative document. Writing, literacy, administrative complexity. In a Judahite context in the 10th century BCE, at a site contemporary with the supposed reign of Solomon, The minimalist argument had rested substantially on the claim that 10th century Judah lacked the administrative infrastructure, including literacy and record-keeping, to support a kingdom of the kind the Bible describes. The Caiapha Ostracon did not simply challenge that claim. It provided direct physical evidence against it. The Ophel excavations, conducted by Eilat Mazar, beginning in 2010 on the slopes of Jerusalem's ancient city of David, the area immediately south of the Temple Mount, added another layer to the emerging picture. Mazar's team uncovered a monumental stone structure dated to the 10th century BCE, a large administrative building or palace complex whose scale and construction technique were inconsistent with the modest provincial settlement that the minimalist model had described for 10th century Jerusalem. The structure was built from massive hewn stones in a style that parallels the monumental architecture at other sites in the region associated with Solomonic period construction. Associated finds included a royal seal impression, a bullet bearing an inscription in ancient Hebrew that Mazar's team identified as belonging to an official of the Judahite royal court, providing direct epigraphic evidence of an organized royal administration functioning in Jerusalem at the relevant period. The Ophel excavations also produced ceramic evidence that Mazar used to argue for a dating of the monumental structure to the 10th century, placing it squarely in the Solomonic period. This dating was contested by Finkelstein and other minimalists who preferred a 9th century dating for the same structures, and the ceramic chronology debate became one of the most contentious technical disputes in the field. The resolution of that debate, which has shifted progressively in Mazar's direction as additional radiocarbon dates from associated organic material have accumulated, illustrates the way that the Solomonic archaeology question has been fought, not primarily over the existence of the evidence, but over its precise placement in time, a narrower and ultimately less fundamental dispute than the earlier argument about whether any 10th century monumental architecture existed at all. The Timna copper mines in the Negev Desert, known in the popular imagination as King Solomon's Mines, from the famous novel of that name, turned out to contain evidence even more precisely relevant to the Solomonic question than their romantic reputation had suggested. Timna is an ancient mining site in the Araba Valley north of the Gulf of Aqaba, where copper ore was extracted and smelted in antiquity, and which the biblical text, through its references to Solomon's wealth and his control of trade routes through this region, implicitly associates with the Solomonic period. Previous archaeological work at Timna had dated the primary period of copper production there to the Egyptian New Kingdom period, roughly the 13th and 12th centuries BCE, apparently ruling out any connection to Solomon's 10th century kingdom. Then a team led by Erez ben Yosef of Tel Aviv University returned to Timna with modern radiocarbon dating technology and applied it to organic material, including donkey dung, food remains, and textile fibers from the smelting camps at the site. The results that came back overturned the previous chronology entirely. The most intensive period of copper production at Timna, the period represented by the largest slag heaps and the most complex smelting infrastructure, dated not to the Egyptian New Kingdom but to the 10th century BCE, to Solomon's century. The site that had been written off as pre-Solomonic turned out to be precisely Solomonic, and the scale of copper production documented there was consistent with exactly the kind of industrial wealth that the biblical narrative attributes to Solomon's kingdom. The textiles recovered from the Timna smelting camps added a detail that the radiocarbon dates alone could not have provided. The fabrics, preserved in the dry desert conditions of the Arabah, were not the rough, undyed material that would be expected from simple workers at a provincial mining camp. They were dyed in colors including blue, red, and yellow, woven with patterns that indicated they belonged to people of relatively high social status. Luxury textiles at a copper smelting operation in the Negev in the 10th century BCE. People with status and resources were overseeing the operation at Timna during Solomon's time, exactly as the biblical account of his wealth and administrative organization would lead you to expect. The Dan inscription, discovered in 1993 and 1994 at the site of Tel Dan in northern Israel, provided the first direct extra-biblical, meaning non-biblical, reference to the house of David ever found in any ancient text outside the Bible itself. The inscription, carved on a basalt stele by an Aramean king and dated to the 9th century BCE, refers to the house of David in the context of a military conflict, using the term as a standard ancient Near Eastern designation for the royal dynasty founded by David. A 9th century Aramean king, writing about his military victories, referring to the Davidic dynasty by name as a recognized political entity, not a reference requiring biblical interpretation, a plain administrative and military text from a neighboring kingdom treating the house of David as a known historical reality. The cumulative weight of all of this evidence, the fortified city at Khirbet Caiapha with its precise 10th century radiocarbon dates, the monumental architecture at the Ophel with its royal seal and administrative documents, the Timna copper mines with their 10th century production dates and luxury textiles, the Dan inscription's direct reference to the Davidic dynasty, and dozens of additional finds at sites including Megiddo, Hazor, and Gezer that the biblical text explicitly names as Solomon's construction projects, has shifted the debate in the field in a direction that the minimalists of the 1990s did not anticipate. It has not produced silence from the skeptical side. Academic debates of this magnitude do not resolve cleanly or quickly, and the technical arguments about ceramic chronology and dating methodology continue. But it has produced something more significant than silence. It has produced a situation in which the complete absence of evidence argument, the argument that was the foundation of the minimalist position, is no longer available. The evidence exists. The question is now what it means, not whether it is there. What makes the Solomonic archaeology question more than a narrow academic dispute about ancient chronology is what it implies about the mechanisms by which historical memory is preserved and transmitted. The biblical narrative of Solomon's reign is specific in ways that go beyond what a purely legendary tradition typically produces. It names specific building projects at specific sites that are now producing specific 10th century archaeological evidence. It describes specific trade networks, the copper of Timnah, the cedar of Lebanon, the trade routes through the Arabah, that are now being confirmed in their broad outlines by physical evidence from those exact locations. It provides specific administrative details, the structure of the royal court, the organization of the kingdom into administrative districts that are consistent with what the emerging archaeological picture of 10th century Judah and Israel actually shows. The Temple Mount itself remains the great unresolved piece of the puzzle. The area where Solomon's temple is supposed to have stood is covered by one of the most politically sensitive religious sites in the world, the compound that includes the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Systematic archaeological excavation of that specific area is not possible under current political circumstances. It may not be possible for the foreseeable future. What the Temple Mount Sifting Project has done, collecting and analyzing the debris removed from the Temple Mount during unauthorized construction work in 1999, is the closest thing to archaeological investigation of the site that current conditions allow. From that sifted debris, researchers have recovered artifacts spanning the full period of the Temple Mount's known religious use, including items from the First Temple period, the era of Solomon and his successors, that confirm intensive human activity at the site during exactly the period when the biblical text places the construction and use of Solomon's temple. The absence of direct excavation at the Temple Mount means that the specific question of what physical evidence of the First Temple might survive beneath the current structures remains genuinely open, not definitively answered in either direction. The minimalist argument that no such evidence would be found if excavation were possible is now considerably harder to sustain given what the surrounding sites have produced. The maximalist argument that the temple stood exactly, where the text says it stood and will be confirmed if excavation ever becomes possible, remains archaeologically unproven. The honest position is uncertainty, combined with a recognition that the uncertainty is narrowing as the evidence from the surrounding sites accumulates. What archaeology has established beyond any reasonable professional dispute is that something was happening in 10th century BCE Judah and Israel that the material record can no longer dismiss as literary invention. Fortified cities with planned layouts, monumental administrative architecture in Jerusalem, industrial copper production in the Negev on a scale consistent with significant royal wealth, luxury goods and administrative literacy at sites dated precisely to the supposed period of Solomon's reign, a neighboring kingdom's inscription treating the Davidic dynasty as a known political reality within a century of Solomon's death. The king that a generation of scholars said left no trace in the ground has been leaving traces everywhere that modern excavation technology has looked for them. The discoveries that shocked the archaeologists who made them were not shocking because they were unexpected in the way of genuinely novel phenomena. They were shocking because they arrived after decades of confident professional consensus that they would not be found. The ground knew something that the scholars had decided it did not. And now that the ground is being asked the right questions with the right tools at the right sites, it is answering in a language that even the most careful professional skeptics are finding harder and harder to dismiss. King Solomon's tomb has never been found. Perhaps it never will be. But the kingdom he built, the administrative apparatus he commanded, the industrial wealth that made him legendary across the ancient world, and the dynasty he inherited from his father David, these are no longer matters that serious archaeology can relegate to the category of pious fiction. They happened. The soil of the southern Levant, tested with radiocarbon, and studied with the full toolkit of modern archaeological science, has confirmed it. The most powerful king of the ancient world left his mark on the earth. It just took us this long and this much science to finally learn how to read it.